Hello, biology students. We kind of finished up with photosynthesis and we're going to dive right into cellular respiration. Remember that we kind of looked at those two equations and we said if we compare kind of photosynthesis to cellular respiration, they're kind of the opposite of each other. And when we looked at photosynthesis, we said the reactants. So on the left side of the arrow, the reactants are carbon dioxide, water, and light energy, which is sunlight, or we could have artificial light energy as well. And then the products are oxygen, or O2, and then glucose, C6H12O2 is the formula for that. But in respiration, which is all about breaking down food for energy, it's really the flip side. So these products that were made in photosynthesis by plants or photosynthetic algae or even photosynthetic by bacteria as well, but these that are produced in photosynthesis are then broken down in cellular respiration. And this process really is the same whether we're talking about photosynthetic things like the plants or the algae or our bodies in our cells. The process is really the same. So we take oxygen and glucose and other molecules and we break that down and into carbon dioxide, water, and energy in the form of ATP. So the energy that's used in photosynthesis is light energy. The energy that's produced in cellular respiration is ATP energy. But again, you can see these reactants are really the same as the products in cellular respiration. The products in photosynthesis are essentially the same as the reactants that are going to be used up in cellular respiration, and that's an important connection. So plants obviously make this glucose, we get it in other ways. So cellular respiration, how cells get energy. So the objective here, how do cells actually convert food to energy? And as I mentioned earlier, very much the same, whether we're talking about plants, animals, algae, bacteria, it tends to be very, very similar throughout all of the Earth's living things. And so the process obviously evolved, we believe, very, very early on in the simplest of organisms. So cellular respiration, the process by which cells break down organic molecules to get energy to fuel cellular processes. So we need ATP to do a lot of things. We talked, in the last unit, we talked about active and passive transport, and we said active transport, we really needed energy to move things through the cell membrane if it was active transport. Well, here's how that energy gets made. So this is really important. Again, the equation, please write this down. This is super important. So when cellular respiration is going to use some oxygen. So if you're a plant, it's because you produce some oxygen. You're going to use some of that up. If it's us, think about how we get oxygen. Right? So we don't make oxygen, but we need oxygen. So every time you take in a deep breath of air to get that oxygen, it's not because your lungs need oxygen. We're taking in oxygen into our lungs because literally the cells, every cell in our body that's going through cellular respiration needs that oxygen. So it goes into our lungs and it's going to diffuse into the bloodstream and into the cells. The blood carries it throughout the body so that it can get to all. So this is C6H12O6. I'm going to write that in. So that's the formula or chemical formula for glucose. And then, so those are the reactants. And the products, we said, there's some CO2. So I want you to think about what happens to the CO2 that builds up in cells. How do we get rid of it, right? Because this is really a byproduct that we don't need for anything. We get some H2O, some water produced, and then energy in the form of ATP. Yay, ATP. as far as living things go, that's the energy molecule and super important. So this is that process, that the formula for how we actually get that ATP. So really important. ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. And you should write this down. You should write all this down. Triphosphate. So what does tri mean? Maybe some of you learned to ride a tricycle when you were young. Tri means on a tricycle, 3 wheels. On ATP, it means triphosphate. It literally means 3 phosphates. So we think of it as this adenosine. So I like to think of it as adenosine. And then there's, actually, try that again. So adenosine will represent with A, and then there's 3 phosphate molecules attached to that. So triphosphate, meaning there's 3 phosphates on it. The little phosphates are kind of used to energize other molecules in the cell in this process, and we're going to talk a little bit about where that comes into play. So this is a biochemical process just like photosynthesis. The first step in cellular respiration is pretty simple. It's something called glycolysis. Glycolysis is literally simply just the splitting of glucose molecules. So that's the first step. I'm actually going to transfer this to the next page. So because this disappeared, please know that I just transferred it. There it is, magically. Glycolysis, the splitting of glucose molecule. This is the first step in cellular respiration. There are 3 steps that we're going to talk about. So this first step, so here's our 6-carbon glucose. Remember, we said it was C6. Each one of these dots represents a carbon. So this is a carbon chain. These are all carbons. It's literally going to split this glucose, this 6-carbon sugar, into 2 3-carbon pyruvate or pyruvic acid. This is the same, pyruvic acid and pyruvate are exactly the same thing. But you can see now we have 1, 2, 3 carbons, but we have 2 of these. So that can make sense, right? So we already have broken down this 6-carbon glucose molecule into something simpler. We have broken it down into a couple of pyruvate or pyruvic acid or 3-carbon molecules. Everything has to be conserved. So if I started with 6 carbons and some hydrogen and oxygen, remember those 2 are going to be conserved. But what we tend to do kind of in this process right here is count those carbons. So lots of things happen here. We also get a couple of ATP made. We also get something called, so my ADP, so this is interesting, ADP is I spelled that wrong already, adenosine diphosphate. So di means 2. So we're really starting with an adenosine with 1, 2 phosphates. And remember when we talked about ATP, we said there's actually on ATP or adenosine triphosphate, there's 3. So it has taken a couple of these ADP and added some, so this is 2 ADP molecules. We added a couple of, this P is my phosphate, sorry, bad handwriting, to produce a couple of ATP. And see how I love this visual because they've drawn it with this lightning or this bright, you know, it looks energized now because ATP has a lot more energy than ADP. Cellular respiration is all about building those ATP molecules. So we also have something called NAD+, we can see down here. we have 2 of these NAD plus molecules that now are converted into a couple of NADH, and then 2 additional hydrogen ions. So these are basically sort of, think of it as like they're building kind of little batteries, if you will, that are going to be used to provide energy later in this cellular respiration process. But remember, glycolysis is just the very, very beginning. So this is the first step. Most of, and here's a quick overview. I think this will be helpful too. So this is a visual of the 3 processes. We learned about cells and organelles already. So worth mentioning here, glycolysis right here. This happens in the cytoplasm. So just in that gel stuff where all the organelles are floating around in there in the cytoplasm, that glucose is going to get broken down into pyruvate or pyruvic acid. Remember, it's the same thing, 2 different names for the same thing. Sort of if your name's Johnny and sometimes they call you John, you're still the same person, right? But this pyruvate or pyruvic acid, it is the same thing. Once this glucose is broken down through the process of glycolysis and we get this pyruvate, this diffuses into the mitochondria. So if you remember when we talked about cells, organelles, and the functions of those organelles, mitochondria was all about making energy for cells. So we might say that cells, for example, that are in your muscles might have a lot more mitochondria than cells that are found in your skin, because muscles do a lot of work, right? We use, even if you're not active, really, really active, your muscles, like I'm kind of standing in my room. It's not like I'm working out or going for a walk or playing football or anything like that, but my cells are using a lot of ATP just from movement, just my everyday movement and breathing and all of the things, and even moving things in and out of my cells through the cell membrane. Remember, those things take energy, and that's really important. So once glycolysis has occurred, we have these pyruvate or pyruvic acid. This diffuses into the mitochondria, and there's actually 2 more cycles. So glycolysis is, let me pick a different color. We might say this is phase 1. The citric acid cycle, this is phase 2. And then this cool little thing called the electron transport chain, which also happens in the mitochondria, is going to be phase 3. So interestingly enough, who's the big player here? Let's look. Through this process of glycolysis, I get 2 ATP molecules. Through the citric acid cycle, which is going to further break down, that's going to break down this pyruvic acid and make some more of those carrier molecules, like the carrier molecules like we saw that on the last, let me go back to that really quickly. So this NADH, this is a carrier molecule. We said it's like charging a battery. It's going to be used later. So, well, it's actually going to be used in this electron transport chain. But look at the ATP production. We got two produced from the citric acid cycle, but oh my goodness, this is the mother load right here. 34 ATP produced in this electron transport chain. So the electron transport chain, we would say, the biggest player in this process, but all 3 of these processes are necessary. We have to go through glycolysis in the cytoplasm. This has to diffuse into the mitochondria in order to go through the citric acid cycle before it can get broken down further and those molecules transferred into that electron transport chain. So we'll pick up with that in the next video.